we cut the music before it gets to all the F-bombs. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking today about the things that you can do with analytics to help you be more successful in optimization. So I'm a senior partner at Analytics Demystified. On a personal note, I have a very angry black cat, a labradoodle with his own Instagram and Facebook page, as everyone does, I'm sure, and a 1-year-old who really enjoys flipping the bird, like so much so that I collected all the pictures and I made a coffee table book, and people think I'm weird. So, as mentioned, analytics is kind of my thing, not really optimization and testing, so you might be wondering, well, what am I doing here? In short, I actually view analytics and optimization as two sides of the same coin. They are really two methods that you can use to test a hypothesis that you might have. So what's a hypothesis? A tentative assumption in order to blah, 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 blah. I find that an easier way to think about this is to focus on asking people to phrase, I believe that, some idea. So it might be, I believe that if we add videos to our product pages, we're going to see an increase in conversion. And, even more importantly, if I am right, then I will take some action and actually do something with that information, which might be building out our product video content. I believe in giving credit where credit is due, so this one goes out to my partner, Tim Wilson, who I feel coined this in like a really concise and easy to understand way, and let that be the first and last time that anyone has ever called Tim concise. So when we think about a hypothesis, we have lots of them. They are typically the foundation of the tests that we run. And there's lots of different ways to answer them. So it might be testing, might be running A/B multivariate test. It might be doing an analysis of the historical existing data that you have. It can be user testing. We've talked a lot about that today. It can be running surveys to get qualitative information. It can be using session replay. There's a lot of different things you can do. Use your call center information. And as we've talked about, the best thing to do is not just to be picking one of them, but to actually be combining multiple to get a better answer. So yes, Google Analytics can tell you what is happening, but qualitative methods can help you answer the why. So I've had companies who have run surveys alongside their tests, who have done user testing of the variations versus the control to understand not only the data that they're seeing in the test results, but get an understanding of why one might perform better than the other. Now, in a really perfect world, there would be this like super clean flow where we have a report or we do an analysis. It reveals some opportunity and we say, I have a hypothesis. And then we run a test and we either prove or don't. We get our results, and then possibly we do some further analysis, and then we go around that cycle again, and it's all wonderful and a great process. In reality, it typically looks a little bit more like this. So I want to talk about some of the ways that you can use analytics that might not be just in that clean, like let's assume it's a hamster wheel. And I'm going to talk about some kind of common and maybe some ones that you guys haven't thought of. So the really obvious one that I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time talking about, because I feel like when people are focused on optimization, they understand a lot of this and they may be already using their Google Analytics or their Adobe Analytics data, is your analysis actually informing your test ideas. So being able to understand that on this form, this field is particularly troublesome, so we are going to experiment removing that if that's an option. We're going to experiment a 2-page form instead of a 1-page form with 20,000 questions. Or looking at your conversion funnel and saying, these are the places that we have the highest drop-off, so of course we're going to focus our optimization efforts there. But one of the things that I really commonly see, especially since I work with a lot of analysts, is that attitude of like, because all I have is a hammer, everything is a nail. So trying to use Google Analytics to answer a question that would be better tested or vice versa. So to be clear, when I'm talking about the data that you're using, I'm definitely going to be talking a lot about digital analytics data, which might be Google Analytics, Adobe, et cetera. I'm also talking about other data sources. So you may have advanced form analytics available. You may have heat maps. You may have session replay. You may have user testing data. You may have surveys or call center data. Any of those can be used to help you understand why you're seeing what you're seeing and address those hypotheses. So one of the things that I found helpful is using your data to help you prioritize your test requests. So a really kind of rough way of doing this might be to look at what the estimated return is for a test versus what the level of effort is to build, deploy, run it, and possibly manage it ongoing. However, in my experience, you can better sell your test idea if rather than just saying, well, I believe that videos, having them present on our product pages could increase our conversion to cart, being able to actually say, I believe that, and if we were able to generate a 2% increase in conversion, that would be $1 million in revenue. Funnily enough, executives really like dollar signs. So one of the things that I have found really helpful is to be able to create a revenue forecast before you even run the experiment. Using your existing data and looking at your traffic, your conversion, your revenue data, and layering on top of that assumptions about the experiment that you're going to run or the hypothesis that you have, and using that to estimate the impact. So we'll take the example that I've been mentioning, which is like, let's kick it Zappos style, and we're gonna have videos on our product pages. So when I'm shopping for a purse, I know exactly how big it is. And what we can do is use our existing data. So it might be your current traffic. So you can plug in some generic amount, say like this is typically the amount of traffic that we get. Then you should have data about what your conversion currently is to your product pages. We then will know from our analytics data what percentage of product page viewers will view an image. What percentage convert from our product page to our cart? And then how possibly is that conversion rate different for image viewers? Because they may already be kind of predisposed to convert at a higher rate. And then on top of that, we can add our assumptions. So we can say, we know that some people view images. What percentage of image viewers or what percentage of product page viewers will view our videos? Let's say we think 5% are going to do that. What percentage lift in conversion do we think that that's going to drive? And we can have several assumptions. We can say like maybe 1%, maybe 10%. Do we think that because people viewed videos that they will have a higher average order value? So we can layer all of those assumptions in to try and calculate some kind of revenue gain. Now, it's really handy to have a worksheet to work from, so if you guys want, this links to a blog post, there's a Google Doc you can use and then kind of build it out for your own purposes. But I have found this really helpful to be able to say, like, this test idea we think can generate this based on the area of the site that it's impacting and our assumptions. And of course, also really important is to keep track of the assumptions and your estimate, and then the test and what actually results from it. Because I've worked with many product managers who claim that every test is going to increase conversion rate by 50%. So the next place that analytics can help you is to better control the uncontrollable in your testing. So another way of saying this is that statistical significance is not enough. There are lots of sites that could run a test and they could reach significance in the course of a couple of hours. That doesn't necessarily mean that those results will hold true long term. So it's really important that when you're testing, you are running your tests on a representative sample of your users. So I'm gonna get a tiny bit nerdy. So a conversation that I had with Matt Gershoff from Conductrix, a really, really smart dude. So we were talking a bit about digital data and some of the challenges with it. And in short, there's two types of data, stationary data and non-stationary. Stationary data means the mean stays pretty similar. The mean, the variance, it's fairly consistent over time. Non-stationary data is not. The mean may shift and sometimes never return to what the previous mean was. Stocks are a really good example of this. They can tank one day and they're never going to come back. Now, there's two problems with this kind of data. One is seasonality. So we like to think that when we are running experiments that we are randomly controlling. Unfortunately, we're really not. We're at the mercy of when our users come to us. From there, we can randomly assign them to two groups. But they come to us based on what works for them, and your seasonality can play into that. So that's why it's important that you are covering that period when you are looking at your test results. So I worked with a company that actually did a really good job of this, using their analytics to understand their seasonality. So we had a ton of historical data going back many years, and we would forecast what we thought not only our traffic volumes, but also our seasonal curves were gonna look like for the next 12, 18, sometimes 24 months in advance. And we were able to use this to plan when we would run experiments and when we would run marketing campaigns, and to understand how similar time periods might behave similarly and how other time periods may behave differently. The really obvious example of this is that if you were to run an experiment on Black Friday, you might not get the same results in April. The second problem that we have with non-stationary data is the concept of drift, or that your results are perishable. So over time, you may not see the same winner. And it can happen for lots of different reasons. So it could be that a new competitor's come into the marketplace. It could be that your results were related to the holidays or some kind of promotion, maybe not taking seasonality into account for long enough. So it's why one of the reasons that you do want to think about kind of repeating experiments over time to make sure that your winners hold true. Now, another place that I have used testing, actually used analytics quite extensively fairly recently is, has anybody actually doubted their testing tool? Like, is this thing working? Is it broken? Okay, I'm not the only skeptic around here. So I have a client who uses a homegrown solution, so their engineers built it, and we wanted to understand whether users were falling into multiple variations, because obviously that's going to affect our test results. And so we did our analysis. We looked at our data in Google Analytics. We were capturing all of this, and we were able to see it's actually pretty low. It's not a huge deal. So then this same company ended up extending this platform to a new brand. And unfortunately, hopefully you guys can see, but it was kind of almost to zero, and now it's at about 2%. So we had issues where when this platform was deployed to the new brand, suddenly we were seeing a lot more overlap between test variations. And we were able to use our analytics data to make sense of this and understand that it was related to a specific browser that shall remain nameless. Not IE6, all the other ones. So as a result, we were able to go back to engineering and actually have them fine-tune the product that we were working on, and also able to use it to make some changes to the way that we were analyzing the results so that we had clean samples. Another useful way of thinking about this is an AA test. So running the control against essentially the control. So I had a company who decided to have a domain change and a testing platform change at the same time because they like to have fun, clearly. So we were a little bit distrustful about if we were just to start testing, well, what if our test results weren't true? So we ran the control, essentially, against the control. And in one place, we actually did find that there is a significant impact. So a 60% lift with confidence. And when we dug into the data, we found that it was actually related to an influx of paid traffic that was not being appropriately distributed. So we were able to use that to isolate our results and also, again, to kind of improve how we were targeting experiments. Another client who created a new sign-up flow and sounded great. They were testing the two against each other, except they had a problem where people would go back and forth between the two experiences, so not a particularly well-controlled test. And what we were able to do is use our data to understand when this was happening. And unfortunately, it was like 5% of their signups, this was happening. So we were able to use that to kind of go back, figure out how to better test so that we were keeping the groups clean, but also to still salvage the data that we had by only analyzing those who saw one of the variations. Now, you don't have to have a broken testing tool for this to come in handy. Lots of companies, especially as you start doing more and more tests, will have overlapping test groups. So you may have a test that's running on the homepage and a test that's running on your product page, and if somebody was to be exposed to both tests and then ultimately convert, well, which one actually drove their conversion? And if you're just looking at the test in isolation, you may never know. So using your analytics data to understand the overlap can help you have cleaner results and ultimately push the right winner live. I'm guessing most of you probably experienced this, which is like, nah, it's cool, we're just gonna launch it. So, much as we may not like it, some things will not be tested. So, an example that I've experienced is pricing changes. There can be PR consequences to pricing changes, where showing different prices to different users can actually get you on the front cover of the Wall Street Journal. So I had a client who had sort of this attitude. They were doing a site redesign a couple of years ago, and it was a really big project, like a 6-month, 9-month, multiple agencies. I don't really want to think about how many dollars involved. And the testing lead within this organization argued really, really hard, like, we need to test this, to the kind of responses of, like, it'll perform better, don't you worry your pretty little head about it. Ultimately successful, and we tested it. And unfortunately, this really expensive redesign performed 3% worse. So we were able to use our analytics data to understand why. So yeah, can happen. So 2 of the things that we found were that the CTA appeared to be related to basically it blending more with the design rather than standing out and being an ugly, garish color that meant that people could see it. The second one that we probably wouldn't have necessarily spotted was when we looked at this global site and we looked at performance in different countries, we found that countries with lower internet speeds had poorer performance and had a more dramatic difference between the control and the redesign, which turned out to be because of an animation that had been added that slowed things down. And so we were able to do an iterative test and say, okay, we're going to tweak the animation, have it there and not there, and also the CTA, and have it in different colors. And then get to a point where the redesign performed similarly to the control, which in this case was really the only goal. So the next place that I find analytics to be valuable is actually to help you dive deeper into your results. So your testing solution will tell you that this performs better, and you can start to understand why. Now, this is not permission to forget your success metric and judge the test by anything positive that you can find in the data. Ultimately, we're still looking at what our success metric was. So I have a client who did a landing page redesign recently. And unfortunately, this landing page redesign, they had like 4 other projects that were contingent upon it rolling out, because the work to go back and retrofit it for the old landing page was going to be really significant. Unfortunately, it performed 8% worse. So we were able to use our analytics data to try and understand why. So we compared the CTAs, and the CTAs in the global nav actually performed similarly. There really was no significant difference. But when we isolated the effects, we were able to understand it was to do with one particular CTA. So the business model, you had to enter your address, and then you would search to see whether you were eligible, and if you were eligible, then you could go through the sign-up process. And we found that the absence of that CTA is what was driving the performance. We were able to add it back into the new design, and then everybody continued on their merry way with the next 4 projects. Another client had an example of what ended up being a Skew test. So this was really early on in their kind of testing. And we ran a test, we got a winner, it actually performed really well, everyone was super excited. And then we were doing some further analysis, and we were trying to understand, past the online conversion to 30 days down the track, what was happening, how were these variations performing? And what we found is that our winner didn't perform very well at converting people offline. And so when we dug into it further, we started to find that there was basically bot traffic in there that was influencing one of the variations in particular. Very smart spammers in this case that were able to fill in forms and do all that good stuff, but were not forking over credit cards to pay for solutions. And so the winner turned out to be something completely different. And if we hadn't been doing that analysis further on down the line, we may not have never seen it. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only time this ever happened. So in this case, we're running an experiment, and we just noticed like the traffic didn't seem to really be evenly distributed. And we found that there was a massive spike over the course of 2 hours, massive spike coming from Indonesia to just the control. So having our analytics data and looking at more than just what was in the reports for the tests allowed us to spot some of the issues where we may have deployed the wrong thing live. So the short way of saying that is, if your spidey sense is tingling, use the extra data that you have to understand why things may not be panning out the way you expect. So I talked about, one of the clients, they had this kind of spammer traffic, and we found that out when we were looking at their offline data. So one of the places that analytics can be really valuable is in helping you test past your online conversion. So a couple business models I've found this to be useful for. One is if you have an online trial and then people later on convert to a paying customer. So I had a client that I worked with, they had a 7-day trial. And after that 7 days, we would analyze the test results and look at their back-end data, lived in a totally separate system, not something that we were really able to do through their testing platform, and see if the results held true. It delayed when we could get our results because obviously we weren't able to get them quite as quickly right when the test ended. We had to wait and see if those people converted. This client then went and did some experimentation around their trial length. So, in this example, they were able to go from, say, like a 90-day trial to a 30-day trial. Now, our online data told us, okay, these perform pretty similarly, no big deal. But when we factored in their offline data, we actually found that there was an increase in conversion to paying customer by having a shorter trial. So it was a huge win because not only were they not hurting the number of trials they were generating, they weren't spending money on customers who weren't going to convert, but they were also getting more paid conversions and another 2 months out of the first year of revenue from these customers where they would have still been in the trial period. E-commerce can often be one where people, whether you're in analytics or optimization, you're like, oh man, it must be sweet to work in e-commerce. It's so easy, everything's online, versus a whole bunch of back-end data. But one company in particular was trying to tackle the challenges of weird sizing. So maybe the men in the room, which apparently is most, don't understand this, but it's literally possible to be an extra small and an extra large in the exact same size. Women's sizing is fun, men's sizing seems so much better. And so what they were trying to do was, instead of the normal boring size chart, was to create a tool where you would enter a bunch of information about yourself, as well as the way you liked things to fit and feel, and they would give you a size recommendation in your actual brand that you were shopping. And so by doing this, their goal actually wasn't to increase conversion. They didn't care. What they wanted to do was to decrease the return rate, because returns, they have a high cost. Somebody has to process them. They're operational costs. You may have a pissed off customer who ends up never buying from you again. And you also have a risk of not being able to resell the goods. So they were able to use their return data coupled with a survey that understood why people were returning. And actually, in the end, they found it didn't make a difference. So they ended up deploying this tool because do no harm model. So in a former life, I spent a lot of time working in a maybe non-traditional business model, and I found that our analytics data is what allowed us to do testing given we didn't have a conversion event. So if you think about something like a content site, you don't have something you're trying to convert people to, you're just trying to get a lot of page views. And some page views may be more and less valuable than others because they're all associated with ad revenue. So in this case, our analytics data allowed us to put a value behind every single page on the site. By doing so, we were able to see, like, okay, how many ads were on the page? Which ads were they? How well sold were they? Because if we were just running a bunch of house ads, obviously even more page views there wasn't really going to help us revenue-wise. And what CPM we were charging for the ads on those particular pages. And so this allowed us to build kind of this idea of like a lookup sheet where we could say, like, if we generate more page views in this area of the site, it's going to be this big a win because we are getting way more money for those ads than other ads in other areas. And it enabled us to actually do testing on a content site, which is just kind of sometimes a bit of a different business model. Analytics also helps you to take a step back. So I see a lot of examples of companies where it's like, okay, well, this test did this and this test did that. But the idea of getting a bigger picture of your results to be able to see what your program as a whole is driving. Now, another creative option that I really liked is the idea of running a year-over-year test or year in the life of experimentation. So I had a client who basically they reverted their site. So they said, what did our site look like 12 months ago? These are all the changes we've made as a result of optimization. And then they tested the old site versus the new site and found, I think they had something like a 30% lift that they had managed to drive in 1 year. So I view everybody as one happy family and lots of kittens and puppies. The reason that I actually like to have analytics and testing living together in an organization, whether it's a client-side organization or an agency, I feel like it allows individual expertise. So if you think about analytics, having your testing people diving really, really deep into your data basically requires that they then have the skills of an analyst. And you may end up in a situation where it's like, oh, yeah, we don't use that variable anymore. You should have used this one. And you can allow your analysts to focus on analytics and your testing people to focus on testing. It also avoids a duplication of work. So if you have people doing multiple things, you may have an optimization team that's working on an analysis for an upcoming test, and you may, unbeknownst to you, have an analytics team that's working on the same thing. It's kind of hard to get resources in this area. If any of you guys are hiring, I imagine that you're probably butting up against that problem all the time. It's really hard to find skilled people. So when you're asking somebody to be like a jack of all trades and to be like an awesome analytics and an awesome testing person, you're making it really, really difficult for you to hire. And the last one is really like the idea of aligning priorities. So, I have worked in companies where they sought at one point to decouple testing and analytics. And the problem with that is that people are always going to be ultimately more responsive to the team that they're in and the team and the management that sets their own priorities. The requirements or requests from another team do fall lower down in the rank. And I work with lots of managers who are like, it's fine. They're going to work really closely together. They're not in the same team, but it's not a big deal. But ultimately, it just never works that way in practice. So having your analytics and your testing people work really closely together actually allows that strength and for everybody to be on the same page as far as what your priorities are. So going forward to Analyse, you can use your analytics data to find opportunities. You can use it to estimate the impact of the tests that you're looking to run so that you're able to prioritize them accordingly. You can then dig into your results to understand why one may be performing differently to the other. You can use it to take your testing further, so it might be that you've been mainly looking at online conversion and you're able to look at other downstream impacts. And also just befriend your analytics people, because we're cool peeps, I swear, we're not total nerds. So this is me. If you guys have any questions, either now or I'll be around for the next 2-3 days.
Thank you very, very much.
Welcome.
You touched upon a ton of different things. I'm glad. There were some important things you touched upon also, among others, I'd say seasonality, sample size pollution, and so on. All very important things for us to think about. Let's do a couple of questions. There's one here that's particularly popular, and that is, when seasonality exists, is it better to test during peak or off seasons? Why?
Depends on what you're testing. So if you're testing something that's an offer, that might be something that you're testing during a period that people are particularly sales-driven. If what you're testing is something that's core functionality, you may want to have more of a controlled sample. It might also be the case where you want to test it during both, just to see how it performs when you have kind of your typical audience versus your, if you think of some businesses like maybe you have a lot of coupon seekers that come at some point, you may want to know how it affects both of those groups.
Yes. AA tests are scary. What do you do if you can never explain the variance? Saw firsthand at major e-tailer, staff analysts, and Adobe consultants all stumped.
So if you've looked into all your analytics, do some user tests, run some surveys, see what other data you can have. So I'm not necessarily saying digital analytics will answer every question, but you should be able to get some additional qualitative feedback to help you understand the results.
I'd also say with AA, no, I'm not going to get into that.
Oh, AA tests, sorry. I focused on A/B tests. I have actually seen that before. I have had some companies where we had AA tests and it was a bit of an issue to find the particular cause. In this one, it was one where we really had to kind of dig to try and find it. So, ideally, not only involving just, in this case it was like Adobe, but also if you have engineering resources, some of it can be like to do with time delays or, them not performing exactly the same, looking at different areas and maybe different connection speeds that people have, because no matter how quick they say some tools are, sometimes that can make a difference.
And also just good old statistics, pre-calculating your sample sizes and so on helps a lot with that. Let's do one more. What is an acceptable level of reassignment or bleed within your testing tool? What checks should you have in place to see if when it breaks?
I think it depends on the organization as to what they will accept. In the example that I have, the first site was like 0.1% and they were okay with that. Once it got to about 2%, they were no longer comfortable with that. For us, it was one of those things where we were able to see like why we were seeing that 2% and know that it was for technical kind of reasons. Like in general, my rule with data is that systems and different data can misalign by about 10%, but in this case, I wouldn't be going anywhere near that high. We definitely started digging once it hit like over kind of 1.5%.
Excellent.
But it probably depends on your sample size a bit too, because it's a lot easier to hit that if you are testing on a smaller site. If it's a test that's only aimed at 5% of your traffic, you may see more significant effects.
Okay. So that's the last question. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.